When the Brooklyn Bridge was first opened in 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It was the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, and it was the first bridge illuminated by electric light. It was truly an engineering marvel, and overnight it earned the nickname the eighth wonder of the world. But what is maybe most remarkable is how the bridge was built to withstand the test of time. Over 140 years later, New York's population has exploded, cars reshaped transit, and landmarks like Penn Station vanished. Yet the Brooklyn Bridge still stands as a global symbol of the city. The truth is, the Brooklyn Bridge is not the same as when it opened. It has evolved with New York City. Today, we're going to look at all the ways the bridge has changed since it was first built, and discover how every person who crosses it becomes a part of that story. I'm Dominique Jean-Louis. I'm the Chief Historian of the Center for Brooklyn History at the Brooklyn Public Library. And today, we're doing a walking tour of the Brooklyn Bridge in New York City. When the bridge first opened in 1883, it was immediately hailed as a huge success. Before the bridge was built, the only way to get from Brooklyn or Queens to Manhattan was on a ferry boat. These ferries were inefficient for large numbers of people, expensive to ride, they were limited to good weather. Sometimes the river would freeze. You couldn't cross the ferry when the river was frozen. So the idea of the Brooklyn Bridge was really born as a solution to this problem of the ferries. But the reality of building the bridge was fraught with issues. The bridge was built with this innovative caisson technology. It allowed the big tower foundations to be dug under the river into the bedrock, and it was revolutionary at the time. They didn't really understand how underwater pressure worked back then, so many workers ended up dying from what was called the bends. The designer of the bridge, John Roebling, was injured during construction and ended up passing away from his injuries. His son took over and he developed the bends while building the bridge, and his wife, Emily Roebling, had to take over, finishing the project. Despite these tragic realities, the bridge was completed, and the first crossing by Emily Warren Roebling became an iconic moment in New York City history. Even though when the bridge opened, there was huge celebrations on both the Brooklyn and Manhattan sides of the bridge, people would soon come to distrust the idea that the bridge was solid enough. On May 30th, 1883, there was a stampede on the bridge. Pedestrians got afraid, thinking that the bridge was going to collapse, and a trampling ensued. 12 people died, 35 were injured, and there was a building distrust that the bridge would really stay solid. So in order to make the public feel a little bit more comfortable with the idea of this bridge spanning the East River, they decided to put on a spectacle. So they took circus pioneer P.T. Barnum and had him parade 21 elephants across the Brooklyn Bridge, 17 camels, and it really showed to the public that if the bridge could withstand the weight of these circus animals, certainly it could withstand the weight of pedestrians crossing the bridge. Because of this, New Yorkers learned to trust a structure as massive as the Brooklyn Bridge. As the public became more used to the idea of crossing the bridge on a pedestrian footpath, it really taught people how to trust bridges more generally. More bridges would be built spanning the East River over the years, and because of the Brooklyn Bridge, people were more comfortable with the idea of bridges being safe. Once people were back on board, the first phase of the bridge's life really began. So even before the bridge was built, Brooklyn was really the first commuter town in the United States. People still worked on the island of Manhattan and then returned home to Brooklyn across the river. But once the bridge was built, it really accelerated this idea of commuting into New York City. And it made Brooklyn a more attractive place to live because you could have the benefits of working in Manhattan and living in a more suburban, rural place like Brooklyn. So one of the unintended consequences of the bridge being built is that more people started to migrate to Brooklyn, which was its own city at the time. When the bridge was first built, it had 9 trolley lines to take people back and forth. And so the bridge really became a thoroughfare for everyday commuters. Trolleys weren't the only way to get across. You also had horses and buggies going across in dedicated lanes. And of course, we have the iconic pedestrian promenade. It was also cheaper to get across the East River on the bridge than on the ferries. It was only 1 cent to cross as a pedestrian, 5 cents if you were riding a horse, 10 cents for a horse and carriage, and of course, if you were taking your livestock across, 5 cents per cow, 2 cents per sheep or pig. You could take your bicycle across for 3 cents. A lot of people don't realize at this time that Brooklyn was still pretty rural. Most people made their living by farming, and that was important because Manhattan was full of bankers and shopkeepers. It wasn't really growing anything at the time. The produce that was fueling the growth of New York City was really coming from Brooklyn. So from the beginning, the bridge needed to adapt to a lot of different modes of transportation. So whether you were commuting to work, whether you were a farmer bringing their wares to go sell in the markets in Manhattan, whether you were taking a promenade for pleasure across the bridge, this bridge really changed the relationship between Brooklyn and the island of Manhattan. So the bridge came about at a time when the population in New York City was really starting to explode. Brooklyn and New York City were two different cities at that point, but because there's now a bridge connecting these two cities, it really strengthens the relationship. So about 20 years after the bridge is built, Brooklyn becomes part of Greater New York and they unify into one city. The population is growing in both places and it continues growing from there. When the bridge was built, there were only about 1 million people living in New York City, and since then it's grown to nearly 9 million. So as the population continued to grow, more bridges were needed. We got the Williamsburg Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, the Queensboro Bridge. So even though there were only about 1 million people living in the city when the bridge was built, the designers knew that the city would continue to grow. So they almost kind of predicted this explosion in population and tried to future-proof the bridge for further growth. It was actually built to be about 4 to 6 times stronger than was needed at the time, making it possible for the bridge to still function today. So the original designers of the bridge got a lot right about future-proofing it. They separated pedestrian traffic from the trains and from the horses and buggies, and they even had enough trolley lines to support commuters going back and forth. But what no one could predict was just how important cars would become. In 1900, there were only about 8,000 personal vehicles in the United States, and by 1920, that number had risen to about 10 million. By the 1940s, cars were ubiquitous in American life, even in an urban metropolis like New York City. The last trolley car ran across the bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan in 1950. After that, the train tracks were removed to make way for cars to be able to cross the bridge. The pedestrian promenade, of course, still remained, combining pedestrian and bicycle traffic. Though the bridge could withstand the weight of 21 elephants crossing, they really hadn't thought about things like the weight of semi-trucks. To put that into perspective, an adult elephant weighs around 3 to 7 tons, but a fully loaded semi-truck will weigh somewhere in the ballpark of 40 tons. Because of all that weight, semi-trucks are still not allowed on the Brooklyn Bridge. That also makes the walking experience a little bit more enjoyable. So because cars could now cross the bridge, more kinds of people could commute from Brooklyn to Manhattan. Highways were opened by this time and people could move from further reaches of Brooklyn and even Long Island all the way to New York City quickly and easily. As cars started letting people move further out into Brooklyn, the waterfront areas became more and more empty. All these warehouses that used to have hundreds of workers were now sitting fallow at the edges of the bridge, which made way in the 1960s and 70s for artists to come in and eventually for those areas to become really lucrative and attractive for wealthier residents. So when you're in waterfront neighborhoods today, you can really see that transition in the architecture. Buildings that used to be commercial warehouses are now for shopping. They're now restaurants. Now, Brooklyn's waterfront and neighborhoods like Dumbo are full of luxury condos, high-end shopping. We see a real transition in how the waterfront is used. But meanwhile, on the Manhattan side of the bridge, car culture in New York City was really ramping up. We're standing underneath the on-ramps to the Brooklyn Bridge on the Manhattan side. Here, you can see the original 19th century anchorage to the bridge. And you can also see these modern supports for the on-ramps. In the 1960s, the FDR Drive was built along the edge of Manhattan as a part of a reimagining of the city's infrastructure by Robert Moses. And at that time, even more on-ramps were added to this side of the bridge. This area, where we're standing now, known as the Brooklyn Banks, was one of the results of that. You can also see it has these unique sloped hills, or banks, which were perfect for skateboarding. So this area, unintentionally, became a haven for this booming new trend of skateboarding. So even this dark, neglected underbelly of the Brooklyn Bridge has now become a famous, celebrated space, even famous enough to be featured in multiple iterations of video games like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. The Brooklyn Banks is just another example of how every part of the Brooklyn Bridge has become a cultural touchstone. Whether it's graffiti artists scaling the top of the towers to tag the bridge, or admirers and commuters sharing the space on the promenade, even here in this sort of forgotten structural area, community and activity is thriving. Every part of the bridge, in some way, is culturally relevant and iconic to someone. And that iconic status would only become stronger in the 1980s, when New York City celebrated the Centennial of the bridge. In the 1980s, New York was booming. Wall Street is having an unprecedented bull market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is increasing over 500% from 1982 to 1987. Real estate developments in full swing. At this moment, when New York is at the center of the world stage, the Brooklyn Bridge celebrated its 100-year anniversary. More than 1 million people lined up on either side of the East River to watch the celebrations. We had 1,000 journalists covering the event. There were multiple days of TV coverage. We had parades, flotillas, big firework pyrotechnics. There were street fairs. There was artwork specially commissioned for this event. These celebrations renewed interest in the bridge across the world and really cemented the Brooklyn Bridge as an icon of New York City. The snapshot of the bridge at that moment became the enduring image of the bridge for that generation and generations going forward. The Centennial image of the bridge really stays in people's consciousness, so much so that when they made renovations on the bridge in 2018, the color changed of the bridge. When they were cleaning it, it made headlines. People were so shocked that the color of the bridge could change, when in fact, the bridge had changed many times since 1883. But that wasn't the only change that happened in this time. After the Centennial, tourism became an even more important part of the bridge. So much so, the bridge had to change again. After the Centennial, tourism boomed. People wanted to use the pedestrian footpath to take pictures. That became unsafe with bicycles going back and forth. They sacrificed the lane of vehicular traffic to move bicycles off the bridge so the pedestrian footpath would be safer for tourists to take their pictures. This is just the most recent example of how the bridge adapts to how people are using it. So today, as when it opened, the Brooklyn Bridge inspires visitors from around the world, but it also serves as a humble workhorse for New Yorkers going about their everyday business. And whatever your reason is, when you cross the Brooklyn Bridge, you play a part in its 140-year history and influence the next chapter of its future. For more stories like this one, be sure to check out other episodes of Walking Tour.